A millionaire returned early and couldn't believe what the maid was doing with his triplets. Daniel Carter stepped out of the car, his suit jacket still bearing the sharp creases of a long day of meetings. The business trip had been scheduled to last 3 days, but he had decided to return a day early, almost by instinct. There was no clear reason he could name, only a heavy feeling in his chest, a weight that had followed him since the moment he left home, since the moment he had left his 3 newborn triplets behind in that vast yet cold mansion. The iron gate opened slowly. Daniel walked into the yard, his expensive leather shoes touching the familiar stone pathway. Everything was strangely quiet. There were no staff members rushing out to greet him, no chaotic chorus of crying babies bursting out the moment the sound of the car engine reached the house. The silence made his heart tighten slightly. It was an abnormal silence for this home. Daniel stopped in the middle of the garden, and at that very moment his entire body seemed to freeze. On the lush green lawn, beneath the gentle afternoon sunlight, Maria Evans was sitting down. She was wearing her simple housekeeper's uniform, her hair neatly tied in a bun at the nape of her neck. In her arms, Daniel's triplets, Leo, Emma, and Lily, were pressed against her in a way that felt almost unbelievable. There was no crying, no struggling, no furrowed faces, none of the tense movements Daniel had grown painfully familiar with over the past months. Instead, there were small smiles and soft, contented sounds. Emma giggled quietly, her tiny hand clutching the edge of Maria's uniform as if it were the safest anchor in the world. Leo rested his head against her shoulder, his wide eyes shining, peaceful in a way that felt unreal. And Lily was intently playing with a button on the uniform, completely unconcerned with the world around her. Daniel could not remember the last time he had seen all 3 of his children calm at the same time. Perhaps never. Since the day Rachel, his wife, passed away in the delivery room, leaving him alone with 3 fragile little lives, Daniel's existence had revolved around 2 things: work and chaos. By day there were meetings, numbers, life-or-death decisions of a CEO in the financial technology industry. By night there was endless crying, the helplessness of holding one baby while the others cried even louder, and exhaustion so deep that he had begun to doubt himself. But the scene before him now did not belong to that world. Daniel remained still, not daring to take even a single step forward. He was afraid that the smallest movement, the faintest accidental sound, would shatter this fragile moment like a dream. The last rays of sunlight bathed the small group in a soft golden glow, making everything look almost unreal. A scene too peaceful, too unfamiliar for a father who had grown used to tension and crying. For months he had tried his best. He had hired the best nannies, bought the most expensive toys, read dozens of parenting books. But not once, not for a single second, had he been able to see his children this calm. And now it was happening, in the arms of a woman he had hired only to clean his house. Daniel Carter took a deep breath. His chest tightened with a feeling he could hardly name, part confusion, part wonder, and part something that felt like hope, an emotion he had nearly forgotten he was still capable of feeling. He stood there in the garden, silently witnessing a moment he had never thought he would live to see. And in that very moment, none of them yet knew that it was the beginning of a quiet but irreversible change, one that would transform the life of a father and of an entire family. Daniel remained standing in the middle of the garden, but his mind drifted back to months earlier, to a time he had never believed he could survive. The day Rachel died, Daniel's entire world collapsed in silence. There was no explosion, no loud, dramatic tragedy, like in the movies. There was only a hospital morning washed in the sterile smell of disinfectant, a corridor cold enough to numb the skin, and the doctor's words, slow and merciless: "We did everything we could." Rachel passed away just as the three babies managed to cry their first cries into the world. She never got to hold them, never got to clearly see each of their faces, never got to say a final word to Daniel. And from that moment on, Daniel Carter became a single father to three newborns, a role he had never, ever been prepared for. By day, he was still Daniel Carter of the outside world, the CEO of a rapidly rising fintech company, a cold, decisive man who controlled everything with reason. But every evening, when the doors of the mansion closed, he became only an exhausted, trapped man standing between three cribs, feeling like a failure. Leo, Emma, and Lily cried almost constantly. Their cries overlapped, surged, piled upon one another until Daniel could no longer tell who needed what. When he picked up Leo, Emma cried louder. When he put Emma down to hold Lily, Leo screamed as if abandoned. Some nights he stood in the nursery with trembling hands, cold sweat soaking his back, his mind completely blank. He tried everything. He hired nannies who were introduced as the best in the city, women with degrees, with experience caring for twins and triplets, with perfect resumes. He paid well above market rates, willing to meet every demand in scheduling and working conditions. But the results were always the same. A few days, at most a week, then they left with the same exhausted helplessness. They cry too much. I've never encountered anything like this. I'm afraid I'm not the right fit. Daniel heard those lines so often they became a familiar refrain. He bought toys recommended by specialists, sensory-stimulating toys, expensive imported items, products advertised as helping babies feel safe. He read books on infant psychology, took online courses, carefully noted every method he was taught. He did everything right, at least in theory. But whenever he bent down to hold his children, the crying only grew more violent, as if his very presence made them uneasy. Some nights, after the babies finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, Daniel sat alone in the dark living room, head bowed, hands covering his face. No one saw the tears falling from a man the world always believed was strong and successful. He wondered where he had gone wrong. He loved his children. That had never been false. But that love seemed unable to find a path to reach them. He felt like a stranger in his own home, a father who existed only on paper, unable to give his children the sense of safety they needed. And deep inside Daniel's heart, there was another pain he rarely dared to face, the emptiness Rachel had left behind. Every cry of the babies reminded him that she was no longer there to help him, no longer there with her gentle voice to soothe them, no longer there with her familiar arms to share the burden. He had tried to fill that void with work, with money, with absolute control. But before those tiny lives, all of it became meaningless. And now, returning to the present moment, standing in that peaceful garden, Daniel suddenly realized a truth that made his chest ache. While he had been struggling in desperation for months, at this very moment his three children were calm in the arms of someone else, someone without childcare degrees, someone not hired to be a mother, someone who had simply stayed. Daniel stood still for a few more seconds, just to make sure that what he was seeing was not the product of exhaustion or a hallucination brought on by days of broken sleep. The peacefulness before him was so different from what he had grown used to that it made him feel out of place in his own garden. This silence was not like the dead, suffocating silence of the house at midnight when the crying had only stopped because of sheer exhaustion. This was a gentle silence, one that breathed, that had rhythm. The leaves whispered softly in the wind, insects hummed in the distance, and tiny sounds came from the three babies, the steady breathing, the soft, satisfied little giggles. Daniel suddenly realized he was holding his breath. He looked more closely, as if afraid of missing some important detail. Maria was not doing anything special. She was not rocking a cradle, not using musical toys, not busy soothing them. She was simply sitting there, her back slightly resting against the tree trunk, both arms wrapped around the three babies in a natural, steady way. Her posture was neither stiff nor tense. It was like someone who had been doing this for a very long time. Emma lay to the left, her cheek pressed against Maria's chest, her tiny hand still clutching the edge of the uniform as an unconscious habit. Leo was in the middle, supported by Maria's other arm, his little body completely relaxed, with no sign of alertness. Lily, on the right, was given a bit more freedom, just enough space for her to fidget in her own small way. It was a small image, yet it made Daniel's heart tighten. He took one more step forward, trying to be as gentle as possible. Just then, Maria lifted her head. Her eyes met his, and in an instant, the peace on her face vanished. Her eyes widened in surprise, then quickly shifted to worry. She looked as if she had been caught doing something wrong. "Mr. Carter?" Her voice grew noticeably smaller. She immediately adjusted her posture as if preparing to stand up. But that movement made the babies react at once. Emma clutched the fabric more tightly, Leo stirred slightly, and Lily wrapped her arms around Maria's arm. A small sound, almost like a protest, escaped Emma's throat. Seeing that, Daniel instinctively raised his hand. "No, please don't stand up." His voice came out lower than usual, almost a whisper. Maria froze. She looked up at him, confusion clear in her eyes, mixed with a trace of tension as if she were waiting for a reprimand. Daniel slowed his steps, keeping a careful distance, as if he were afraid that he himself might shatter something fragile. I just want to look for a moment," he continued, his voice hoarse. "Please stay like that." Maria hesitated for a few seconds. She looked down at the babies, then back at Daniel. Finally, she gave a small nod and settled back in place, gently adjusting her arms so Leo could be more comfortable. Daniel let out a long breath he had not even realized he was holding. This was the first time since Rachel's death that he had seen his children like this, not through security cameras, not in those rare moments when they had fallen asleep from exhaustion, but fully awake, calm, held, and protected. And the one who had brought them that feeling was Maria. A woman he had once thought was only a very small, very faint part of the chaotic machinery of his life. Daniel said nothing more. He simply stood there, silently watching, as a question slowly rose within him. What had happened while he was away? Daniel remained still, his eyes never leaving the three children. The silence between him and Maria carried a strange weight, not uncomfortable, but as if both of them were being careful not to shatter this fragile moment. At last, Daniel spoke. "How long have the children been out here?" His voice was low and slow, as though speaking any louder might be enough to make everything collapse. Maria flinched slightly. She looked down at Leo first, then lifted her gaze to answer, her voice cautious. "Just a few hours now, sir." "A few hours?" Daniel repeated, frowning slightly. "And where is the nanny?" The moment the question was spoken, Daniel noticed a subtle change in Maria's expression, not fear, but hesitation, mixed with something like guilt on someone else's behalf. "She left early yesterday morning," Maria said softly, before it was fully light. Daniel felt his heart sink. He was used to this, yet every time he heard it again, it hurt just the same. Without saying anything, Maria shook her head. She left a note in the kitchen, apologized, and said she couldn't continue anymore. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. He was not angry, not surprised. Only a familiar weariness rose within him, as if someone had quietly placed another heavy stone on his chest. "So, you stayed alone with the children?" he asked, his voice even lower this time. Maria nodded. "Yes, sir." "All through last night?" "Yes." "And today?" "Yes, still." A heavy silence fell. Daniel looked around the garden for the first time with different eyes. Not far away, a thin mat was spread over the grass. A few familiar toys lay scattered around, items he had bought at considerable expense, but had almost never seen truly used. Beside them was a small basket. Daniel stepped closer and looked inside. Empty baby bottles, a few plastic bowls still smeared with cooled food. Not the signs of something hastily arranged, but traces of time, of many consecutive hours of continuous care. He turned back to Maria. "You have been taking care of them since yesterday?" Maria lowered her head slightly, as if the question embarrassed her. "Yes. I couldn't leave them alone, sir." "Did you call the agency? Or call me?" Daniel asked, unable to hide the tension in his voice. Maria shook her head. "I thought about it, but you were on a business trip, and the babies were crying so much. I thought maybe taking them outside for some fresh air might help." Daniel swallowed. "And you did all of this by yourself?" "Yes," Maria replied, then quickly added, as if afraid of being misunderstood. "I only did what I thought was necessary, sir. I didn't mean to go beyond my responsibilities." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. In the 3 weeks Maria had worked here, he had hardly paid her much attention. She arrived early, worked quietly, always kept the proper distance. He had never imagined that this woman could shoulder 3 babies for more than 24 hours straight, without complaining, without protesting, without even trying to pass the responsibility to someone else. "The babies cried a lot after the nanny left," Maria continued, her voice lowering. "I just thought maybe they needed to be outside, needed sunlight, needed someone to stay with them." Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had hired so many people to stay with his children. He had paid for that presence, yet not one of them had stayed when everything became too difficult. And Maria, the woman who had not been hired to do this, had stayed. Not because of a contract, not because of money, but simply because the children needed someone. Daniel looked again at the 3 small faces resting peacefully in Maria's arms. A strange feeling, both painful and awakening, spread slowly through his chest. Something was changing, slowly but unmistakably, and he knew that he was about to face a truth he had long been trying to avoid. Daniel still had not taken his eyes off the 3 children. The longer he looked, the more it felt as though he were standing before an answer he had been searching for everywhere for months, yet always in the wrong places. "How did you do it?" At last he spoke, his voice lowering, no longer carrying the familiar control of a CEO, but the genuine confusion of a father. "I mean, how could you make them this calm?" Maria looked up at him. Genuine surprise crossed her face, as if the question were far greater than anything she was actually doing. "I didn't do anything special, sir." She spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I just stayed with them." Daniel frowned slightly. "That's all?" Maria nodded. "Yes, that's all." The simplicity of the answer left Daniel stunned. He had expected a method, some specific technique, some secret he could memorize, write down, and apply like so many other things in his life. But Maria offered no formula at all. She looked down, adjusted Emma's position, her hand gently stroking the baby's back in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Emma let out a small sigh and pressed her cheek closer to Maria's chest. "Children," Maria continued, her eyes still on the babies, "they can feel very clearly when someone is truly with them." "With them?" Daniel repeated. "Yes," Maria nodded slightly. "Not just present in the same room, but there with your whole heart." Daniel felt those words strike deep into his chest. Maria went on, her voice gentle, yet certain. "They're still too young to understand words, but they understand feelings. They understand warmth, heartbeats, familiar voices. When I hold them, I don't rush. I don't worry about doing things right or wrong. I just think, I'm here, and they're not alone." She lightly gestured to each baby, as if introducing 3 distinct individuals rather than one indistinguishable set of triplets. Leo needs to be held a little tighter. He startles easily. Daniel found himself looking at Leo, realizing it for the first time. Emma likes to be pressed close to the chest. She feels safer when she hears a heartbeat. Maria smiled faintly as Emma stirred, as if in agreement. And Lily, she paused briefly. She's more independent. She just needs to know someone is there, but still wants to explore on her own. Daniel swallowed. For all this time, he had seen the three children as a single problem to be solved. He had never truly seen them as three small people with different needs. I talk to them a lot, Maria continued, even though I know they don't understand everything. I tell them what I'm doing, what the weather is like today, what birds are in the garden. And you sing to them? Daniel asked softly. Maria nodded. Yes, the songs my mother used to sing to me when I was little, when I was scared, or when I couldn't sleep. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The image of Maria singing while doing housework, soothing three babies who were not her own, rose so vividly that his eyes burned. Sometimes, Maria added, I tie two of them to myself with cloth wraps from the nursery, one in front, one on my back. That way, I can still work, and they can stay close, hear my heartbeat. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at her as if he had just heard something both simple and extraordinary. I think, Maria hesitated, then continued very softly. Maybe they don't need more toys or new methods. Maybe they just need to know that someone won't leave when things get hard. Her words struck directly at the wound Daniel had been hiding for months. He had been with his children. Yes, but he had never truly stayed. He had always been rushed, always tense, always afraid of doing things wrong. And in that fear, he had unintentionally made himself distant. Daniel took a deep breath. For the first time since Rachel's death, he did not feel that he needed to have an immediate answer. Only one thing stood clearly in his mind now. Perhaps what he had been missing all this time was not knowledge, but presence. A long silence fell after Maria's words. Daniel remained standing there, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his heart beating heavily in his chest. He felt as though he had just been placed before a door he had never dared to open, a door that led straight into his greatest fear, the fear that no matter how hard he tried, he would never be good enough to become a place of safety for his children. Just then, something very small happened. Emma, nestled in Maria's arms, suddenly stirred. She shifted slightly, then slowly turned her head. Her large, clear eyes looked straight at Daniel. Not afraid, not uncomfortable, just a curious gaze, as if she were truly seeing him for the first time. Daniel held his breath. Then, very slowly, Emma lifted her tiny hand. Her soft, clumsy fingers trembled in the air and reached straight toward him. Daniel felt his entire body go rigid. He had imagined this moment countless times. But in those imaginings it usually ended with heartbreaking cries, with the familiar panic that forced him to hurriedly hand his child back to someone else. Old reflexes surged up, urging him to step back. "She's reaching for you." Maria's voice came very softly, yet steady. "You can hold her?" Daniel turned to look at her. In Maria's eyes there was no pressure, no urging, only a strangely calm trust. "Don't be afraid," she added, giving a small nod. "She wants to come to you." Daniel swallowed hard. He stepped forward, slowly, carefully, as if entering a fragile land that could collapse at any moment. He reached out, his large adult hand trembling slightly as it touched those tiny fingers. The first contact happened in silence. Emma did not pull her hand away. On the contrary, she gently tightened her grip, as if testing that connection. 1 second, then 2. Daniel felt something break open inside his chest, not loudly, but so deeply it took his breath away. He bent down, slipped his arms around his little daughter, and lifted Emma from Maria's arms. Every movement was so slow it was almost hesitant, afraid that a single careless motion might make everything disappear. He waited for crying, but none came. Emma lay snug in his arms, her small body pressed against his chest, her eyes still wide, watching him closely. Then, as a reward Daniel had never dared to dream of, her pink lips curved into a very small, but completely real, smile. Daniel felt his eyes burn. "Hello, my love," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Daddy's here." He did not dare to hold her too tightly, nor to loosen his arms. He simply kept her there, feeling her warmth, feeling that light yet sacred weight. His heart beat fast, then gradually slowed, matching Emma's steady breathing. Leo and Lily were still in Maria's arms, but they did not cry. Both simply watched in a strangely calm way, as if this moment, in some quiet way, was something that was meant to happen. Daniel lifted his head and looked at Maria over his daughter's shoulder. In her eyes, he saw a deep understanding, as if she knew exactly how important this moment was for him. And Daniel understood that from the instant Emma reached out her hand, something had changed forever. Not in the children, but in him. Daniel continued to hold Emma in his arms, feeling her steady breathing against his chest. The sensation was still too new, too fragile, making him almost afraid to move. Yet at the same time, in his mind, a thought was becoming clearer than ever. He looked up at Maria. Leo and Lily were still with her, calm, not crying, a sight that only days earlier Daniel would have considered unimaginable. Now it was unfolding right before him, and it was no longer a coincidence. "Maria!" Daniel spoke, his voice lowering, carrying a rare seriousness. "I need to ask you something." Maria looked up at once, instantly becoming tense. Her hands unconsciously tightened around Leo and Lily, as though she were used to bracing herself for a reprimand or a boundary about to be drawn. "Yes, sir." Daniel took a deep breath. He glanced down at Emma once more, then looked straight at Maria. If I ask you to stay here," he said slowly, each word carefully weighed. "Not as a housekeeper anymore, but as the person directly caring for my children. Would you agree?" Maria froze. Her eyes widened, clearly not believing what she had just heard. Several seconds passed in absolute silence. Daniel could see the confusion on her face, mixed with surprise, worry, and something that looked like fear. What do you mean, sir?" Maria asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You want me to replace the nanny?" "No." Daniel shook his head at once. "I don't want you to be just another nanny." He tightened his arms gently around Emma, as if reminding himself why he was saying these words. "I am still their father. I want to be with them, to learn how to care for them, but I need someone who understands them, someone they trust, and that person is you." Maria looked down at the two babies in her arms, then at Emma, resting peacefully in Daniel's. Her eyes reddened quickly, as if something inside her had just been touched. "Sir?" She hesitated. "I am not professionally trained. I don't have any degrees in childcare." Daniel shook his head, his voice firmer. "That's exactly why I need you. The ones with degrees have come and gone. But you stayed." Maria was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was lower, slower. "I grew up in a big family," she said. "After my father left, my mother had to work 2 jobs. I took care of my younger siblings. I know how it feels for children to cry and not know whether anyone will come back." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "And when I heard these 3 babies crying," Maria continued, tears beginning to fall, "I couldn't walk away. I couldn't." Daniel looked at her, then said slowly, "I will adjust everything, salary, hours, responsibilities. I only have one honest question to ask." He paused. "Are you willing to stay with my children?" Maria took a deep breath, then nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice choked but certain. "I am." And in that moment, Daniel knew he had just made the most important decision of his life. That decision did not create a miracle overnight, but it began a quiet, steady process of change, and for the first time in many months, Daniel no longer felt that he was struggling alone. In the days that followed, Daniel began to reshape his life in ways he had never before imagined. He reorganized his work schedule, moved aside meetings that were not truly necessary, and declined short business trips that he would once have accepted without hesitation. With his partners, he was still the decisive Daniel Carter. But when the clock moved toward late afternoon, he came home earlier, no longer carrying a sense of escape, but one of anticipation. Maria became the primary caregiver for the 3 children. Daniel hired someone else to handle the housework, freeing Maria completely for Leo, Emma, and Lily. But more importantly, Daniel did not stand aside and merely observe. He learned. He watched how Maria held each child, not with the same posture, not with the same rhythm. Leo was held closer, more securely. Emma was often pressed to the chest to hear a heartbeat. Lily was given more space, yet always kept within reach. Daniel began to follow her lead, at first clumsy and stiff, but patient. He learned to lull his children to sleep, not with urgency, but with his own breathing. He learned to speak to them, telling them very small things, whether the day had been cloudy or sunny, that a new flower had bloomed in the garden, or simply, "Daddy is here." Some evenings he sat on the living room floor, his back against the sofa, one child in his arms while the other 2 played nearby. No longer the familiar chaos, just peaceful presence, something he had once thought was too much to ask for. Daniel also learned to listen, not just to crying, but to the differences in each sound. He realized that Leo often cried because he needed to be held. Emma became unsettled when it was too noisy. Lily tired easily if overstimulated for too long. These small things he had never noticed before now became precious clues. At times, he still failed. There were nights when, despite all his effort, one of the 3 babies continued to cry endlessly. But unlike before, Daniel no longer panicked. He did not rush to give up. He held his child, took deep breaths, remembered Maria's voice, remembered the rhythm she used. And little by little, calm returned, not only to the baby, but to him as well. Maria never scolded him when he did things wrong. She simply adjusted his hand placement, corrected his rocking rhythm, or smiled encouragingly when he did things right. Her patience was like a solid foundation that allowed Daniel to learn without fear of failure. Gradually, the small changes accumulated into something profound. The 3 children began to seek Daniel out more often. Not always, but enough for him to notice. They no longer avoided him. Some afternoons, when he stepped into the house, Leo was the first to look up at him. Emma turned her head at the sound of his voice. Lily crawled closer, her hand touching the leg of his trousers as a newly formed habit. The house that had once been filled with crying now began to carry laughter. Not loud, not perfect, but real. And within that change, Daniel felt the most important truth. He was no longer learning to be a father alone, and he was no longer an outsider in the lives of his own children. A year passed faster than Daniel had ever imagined. The garden behind the house was bright with sunlight and laughter that day. Colorful balloons were tied along the white fence, gently swaying in the breeze. On the lawn, a long table was set simply yet warmly, a birthday cake placed at its center, covered with soft frosting with 3 tiny candles. Leo, Emma, and Lily were turning 2. Daniel stood a few steps back, a glass of water in his hand, his eyes never leaving the 3 children running around on the grass. They were no longer the tiny, constantly crying babies of the past. Now all 3 could run, laugh loudly, and call each other's names in clumsy but excited sounds. Leo ran the fastest, his short legs moving quickly, laughing out loud when he tripped, then getting back up as if nothing had happened. Emma moved more slowly, but her eyes always searched for Daniel whenever she needed reassurance that Daddy was there. Lily was curious about everything, touching balloons one moment, then sitting down to pick at the grass the next, as if the world were a miracle constantly unfolding. Daniel smiled. A year ago he had never dared to imagine this scene, a party without panicked crying, without the heavy tension pressing on his chest. Only real, simple joy. Maria stepped up beside him, a napkin in her hand. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded, still watching his children. "More than okay," he replied. "I never thought I could be this happy." Maria smiled. She no longer wore a housekeeper's uniform. Now she dressed simply like a member of the family. No one present that day saw her as staff. She was the one who stayed until the very end of every evening, who knew each small habit of the children, who had walked beside Daniel through the hardest days. "Daddy!" The call pulled Daniel from his thoughts. Emma stood a few steps away, her arms wide open. Without hesitation, Daniel bent down and opened his arms to her. Right after, Leo and Lily ran over too, and all three children rushed into his embrace at once. Daniel knelt down, wrapping all three in his arms. A familiar feeling, yet one that still made his heart tremble, the feeling of being needed, of being trusted. "Daddy's here," he whispered, even though he knew the children could not yet fully understand the words. Maria watched from behind, her eyes shining with emotion. She had witnessed that transformation day by day, from a lost man who had once been afraid of closeness, into a father his children sought first whenever they needed comfort. When the birthday cake was brought out and the 3 candles were lit, Daniel held Lily, Maria held Leo, and Emma stood between them, gently supported by Daniel from behind. As the candles were blown out amid applause, Daniel felt his throat tighten, not from regret, but from gratitude. He realized that the success he had chased for so many years, big contracts, impressive numbers, had never brought him the sense of fullness that this moment did. 1 year of presence, 1 year of staying, and a family rebuilt from things that once seemed very small. That night, after the party had ended, the garden returned to its familiar quiet. The balloons had been cleared away, the tables and chairs neatly folded, leaving only the soft yellow lights casting a gentle glow over the grass where the children had laughed and played all afternoon. Leo, Emma, and Lily were sleeping soundly in their room, their breathing steady, their small faces so peaceful that Daniel stood in the doorway for a long time, unable to make himself leave. He bent down and gently kissed each of their foreheads in turn, a habit he had never imagined he would have a year earlier. He stepped out into the garden and sat down in the very spot from a year ago, the place where he had frozen when he first saw his children peaceful in Maria's arms. The night breeze brushed softly against him, carrying the familiar scent of grass and flowers. The sky was vast and still. Daniel lifted his eyes to the sky, where stars shimmered faintly in the darkness. And in that moment he thought of Rachel. He pictured her gentle smile, the warm gaze she would have given the 3 children if she were still here. A familiar sadness rose within him, but it was no longer sharp. It had become a quiet part of his heart, no longer bringing him to his knees. "I'm trying," Daniel whispered, as if speaking to her memory. "And I will keep trying." He realized that for a long time he had confused responsibility with presence. He had believed that as long as he provided material comfort, safety, and a secure future, love would automatically reach his children. But he had forgotten the most important thing. Children do not need a perfect person. They need someone who stays when things are hard, who stays when they are tired, who stays even when they do not know if they are doing things right or wrong. Daniel understood that without Maria he might still be running in circles within his own despair. She had not come to replace him, but to show him the path of patience, of unconditional love, of being present with his whole heart. He promised himself that he would never return to the man he used to be, that he would not place work above peaceful evenings with his children, that he would not let the fear of failure keep him from drawing close to them, and that he would never forget the greatest lesson life had taught him in such a gentle yet profound way. True success does not lie in what we achieve outside, but in those who are waiting for us to come home. Daniel stood up, stepped back inside, and quietly closed the garden door. The house sank into a warm, gentle peace, not perfect, but real, and for him, that was enough.